You're listening to an Airwave Media podcast.
This Father's Day, the Home Depot has same-day delivery on the perfect gift to help Dad be everything he can be. Because your dad is more than just a dad. He's groundskeeper of the yard, the perfecter of the patio, and the cleaner of the clippings. Let the Home Depot help power Dad's doing with the convenience and gas-like power of Milwaukee cordless outdoor tools. Plus, get up to $150 off select Milwaukee tools. For everything Dad is, find the perfect gift at the Home Depot. How doers get more done. Order select and stock items by 4 p.m. subject to availability.
There's no better feeling than a personal win, and the State Farm Personal Price Plan can help you do just that. Talk to a State Farm agent today to learn how you can bundle and save with the Personal Price Plan. Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there. Prices are based on rating plans that vary by state. Coverage options are selected by the customer. Availability, amount of discounts and savings, and eligibility vary by state.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, episode 182, The Fall of France, the Invasion of the Netherlands. One of the challenges when covering major campaigns on a podcast is how to organize events. I've always thought that jumping around too much geographically can be very confusing, but that means that we'll have to bounce around through the first 5 days of the German invasion over the following handful of episodes. This is because on the morning of May 10th, German operations would begin against the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France. We're going to discuss them in roughly that order, focusing primarily on the days between May 10th and May 15th for each geographic area in turn. The reason I think that this time frame makes the most sense is due to the fact that by the 15th, the events in the Netherlands and Belgium had largely been decided, although the fighting was not yet complete. In France, the German forces would cross the Meuse on the 13th, and by the 15th, it was clear that the attacks in the south were a major point of effort for the German army, which shifted the complexion of the entire campaign as the French tried to find a way to stop the German advance. But there will be plenty of time to talk about the French later. Today, we start with the Dutch. At a high level, the Dutch government believed that neutrality was the best policy before the war, a view that they shared with the Belgian governments of the late 1930s. The basic theory was that by maintaining neutrality, they did not give either side an excuse to attack them because they were not working with the enemy, while at the same time, it would reduce the likelihood of attack because neither side would want to be seen as the aggressor. Given the aggressiveness of Germany in 1940, it is easy to criticize this strategy, and it would fall completely in the face of German actions. But that doesn't mean that if the nations had been fully supported by the French and British war effort, if they had signed some kind of alliance, that the result would have been different in any way. In Germany, war plans of the late 1930s just assumed that Dutch neutrality would be breached during the opening German attacks to provide a wider front of advance into Belgium and then into France. The exact territory that would be taken and the exact path of the offensive into Dutch territory would shift over time as the specifics of the German plans were determined. But it was always going to happen, which makes Dutch neutrality seem a bit silly in hindsight, but they didn't know exactly what the German plans were like we do today. But for their part, the Dutch intelligence services knew that the Germans might attack them, and they knew that that chance was growing by the day after the beginning of the war in the West in September 1939, and they had some pretty solid intelligence about what they thought were the German plans. This intelligence was provided by sources in Germany and contained very detailed information about Germany's preparations and their plans. Unfortunately, the primary sources on this intelligence is pretty spotty today because so much of it would be destroyed during the German invasion and then during the years of occupation. But one of the sources that we do have is the writings of the American Army attaché in The Hague during 1939 and 1940. This attaché would be able to view the Dutch intelligence summaries during this time and would report on their contents to the American government. And these reports still remain intact. So it's kind of a primary, secondary source kind of thing. The picture that is painted is an intelligence service that had a good handle on everything that the Germans were doing near the border, with precise details of the number and composition of troops that were present and the infrastructure work that was being done behind the lines. Airfields near the border, for example, were noted for their new and increasing military activity, and there were also German efforts to expand those airfields which seemed to be a clear sign that they would be used for the attack. Along with this information of activities close to the border, Dutch intelligence would also have access to a source within Germany which would inform them before an attack was scheduled to begin. This was, of course, immensely valuable, and the source was providing good, solid information. But that was, in some ways, a problem. During late 1939 and into the spring of 1940, there were multiple instances where a date was set for the invasion in Germany only for it to be later postponed. This would occur roughly 29 times, although for the most part, none of these dates saw the attack sort of happening, or none of them got close to happening before they were delayed, but it still happened all the time. In many of these instances, the German High Command was sort of just throwing a date on a calendar and then postponing it well in advance. But every time this happened, those dates were reported to Dutch intelligence, and then Dutch intelligence would inform the government and the military leaders, and each of them would result in some amount of escalated alert levels for the Dutch army. Unfortunately for the Dutch forces on May 10th, by the time that the actual German attack began, the alerts had kind of become routine, and there was concern at Dutch High Command that the constant warning dates were just false information. And this kind of doubt meant that the Dutch military forces were less prepared on May 10th than they probably would have been otherwise. While they hoped to escape being pulled into the war, as they had escaped being pulled into the First World War, preparations were still made for the defense of the Netherlands from a German attack. At the highest level, the Dutch plan was to delay the Germans as long as possible. This meant that along the frontier, troops would be positioned, but they would almost certainly be forced to retreat back into defensive positions set back a bit from the border. Many of these defensive positions and then fallback positions were anchored on waterways, with the various Dutch rivers providing areas where it was hoped that the outnumbered Dutch defenders could delay a German advance. Plans were also put in place to make some sort of man-made flood zones that would be used to restrict German movement and to reduce the length of defensive lines that the Dutch forces would have to hold. As the Dutch forces executed these pre-planned sort of fallback maneuvers, there were two primary goals. The first was to defend the main population centers along the coast for as long as possible, those being Amsterdam, The Hague, and Rotterdam. The second was to maintain a communication route with Belgium and therefore to the Western Allies, in the hopes that this route could be used for British and French reinforcements to arrive. The positions around these larger cities was known as Fortress Holland, and had been a major point of effort for the Dutch military in the years before the war. Even though this was probably the best plan that could be put in place, any Dutch defensive plan was hampered by three realities. The first was that the best Dutch troops, their best trained and their best equipped, were in the Dutch East Indies, and those that remained at home were reservists of various qualities. At the start of the war, what troops that were available were mobilized, which resulted in about 280,000 men being brought into the military and prepared for action. But their equipment was a bit antiquated, although there were some modern weapons, some anti-tank weapons, some anti-aircraft guns that were available. They were just probably a little too rare. The second problem was that within the boundaries of neutrality, there were limits on how much the Dutch military could coordinate with the other nations of Western Europe. Under the general agreements around neutrality, the Dutch could not hold any official military discussions with other belligerent nations. They could not coordinate their efforts or make military plans that could be put into action. This resulted in a situation where the Dutch were heavily dependent on French and British aid for any long-term defense against Germany, but they could not discuss in detail what that aid would be before the war started. The French were considering sort of pushing all the way into the Netherlands, sort of the southwest area of the country, but no provisions were made to work with this plan among the Dutch military, or to coordinate a defensive strategy that would have made a sort of the meetup a successful effort between the Dutch and French forces. The third reality was that it was very likely that any defensive campaign would end in defeat, and there was very little that the Dutch government or military could do about that. You could call it defeatism, I guess, or realism, or whatever you want to call it, but the outlook was bleak. In 1948, the Dutch Minister of Defense in 1940 would say that in 1940, the general assumption that he was basing his decisions on, again, he's the Minister of Defense, was that the Dutch defense could hold out for maybe 5 days. Like he was targeting 5 days. After those days, those 5 days, maybe stretched out to a couple more days if they were lucky. If Allied assistance had not arrived in reasonable numbers, then the Dutch would probably be forced to capitulate. On the German side, they were trying to speed along the Dutch defeat as much as possible, because the quicker that the Dutch forces were removed from the equation, the quicker that the German forces used for the attack could transition to other areas. The German General von Bock would refer to the Netherlands as the Dutch Water Park, and that would be a good way to describe the campaign that would follow, which was almost entirely structured and driven by water obstacles in the form of rivers, lakes, and sort of man-made submerged areas. To try and speed things along, and particularly because of the nature of the terrain in the Netherlands, crisscrossed with various waterways, a major component of the German attack would be the 7th Flieger Corps, which was made up of parachute and air-transported infantry. These troops would be dropped in various areas around the country to capture a few key bridges and airfields, and once this was complete, a larger number of air-transported forces would be brought in to expand the areas under German control while they waited for German ground forces to arrive. There would also be a major airborne operation that would target The Hague, with one of its goals, sort of one of its stretch goals, being to directly attack the Dutch government, and if things went perfectly, to maybe capture the Queen. These airborne operations were risky, and the forces used were not equipped or prepared for a long defense, and were completely dependent on the rapid arrival of support. This was very similar, at least in concept, to the German attack into Denmark that had happened a few months earlier, and that had been part of the invasion of Norway that we covered in earlier episodes. The ground troops would be made up of two different groups. In the south would be the 9th Panzer Division and some motorized infantry, which would be given the task of quickly attacking through the south end of the country, aiming for Tilburg and Breda, to prevent any kind of assistance from arriving from the west. Along the northern area of the border, infantry troops would be pushed forward as well, but generally at a slower pace. Due to the importance of the airborne operation, the Luftwaffe attacks would be seen as critical in the hours before the air transport began, and in the early hours of May 10th, the Luftwaffe would focus on Dutch airfields with the goal of attaining complete aerial superiority. They would largely be successful in these efforts, although this could probably just be attributed as much to the lack of air power among the Dutch Air Force as to any actions of the Luftwaffe. They were just totally outclassed.
Want to learn how you can make smarter decisions with your money? Well, I've got the podcast for you. I'm Sean Piles, and I host NerdWallet's Smart Money Podcast. On our show, we help listeners like you make the most of your finances. I sit down with NerdWallet's team of nerds, personal finance experts in credit cards, banking, investing, and more. We answer your real-world money questions and break down the latest personal finance news. The nerds will give you the clarity you need by cutting through the clutter and misinformation in today's world of personal finance. We don't promote get-rich-quick schemes or hype unrealistic side hustles. Instead, we offer practical knowledge that you can apply in your everyday life. You'll learn about strategies to help you build your wealth, invest wisely, shop for financial products, and plan for major life events. And you'll walk away with the confidence you need to ensure that your money is always working as hard as you are. So turn to the nerds to answer your real-world money questions and get insights that can help you make the smartest financial decisions for your life. Listen to NerdWallet's Smart Money Podcast wherever you get your podcasts.
Hey there, I'm Dylan Lewis, one of the hosts of Motley Fool Money. Each weekday on Motley Fool Money, we talk through the business news you need to know and the stories moving stocks on Wall Street. On weekends, we dive into the industries shaping tomorrow and host the experts, authors, and executives that understand them. Tune in for insights, a long-term perspective on investing, and of course, stock ideas. Plenty of them. To quote a listener, it pays to listen. Check us out and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.
Up to May 10th, 1940, the German airborne troops had a pretty solid record of success in Denmark and Norway, but in their bold attacks in the Netherlands, they would experience some serious problems. Near The Hague, the goal of the paratroopers that were dropped in the early hours of the attack was to capture a series of 3 airfields, which would be used to land Ju-52s that were loaded with German infantry and supplies. A battalion of airborne troops would be dropped on the airfields, and their initial goal was accomplished, and the airfields would be captured. This was going exactly according to plan. However, when the very first Ju-52 arrived with its load of infantry, it would become stuck on the soft grass runway. This completely blocked the airfield, and the transports that were following had to divert onto a nearby beach, where several of them crashed and some others were shot down by Dutch fighters due to their delayed landings. Other transports would arrive, but over the hours that followed, instead of solidifying their control of the airfields to keep them clear for further reinforcements, the Germans would begin to lose control of them under the pressure of Dutch counterattacks. By the end of the day, the airfields were back in Dutch hands, which was a serious problem for the German forces that had already been landed because they were heavily dependent on continued support from German transport planes to sustain their defense. Other German air operations had experienced similar problems, but they also had some successes. In Rotterdam, seaplanes would be used to land some initial infantry right in the middle of the city, which allowed them to take the critical Willems Bridge. This was the final bridge on a chain of bridges that had been captured by small units of German airborne troops, which led from the German border all the way to Rotterdam. The Willems Bridge would almost prove to be a bridge too far, though, and throughout the morning the German defenders would experience heavy Dutch counterattacks and were barely able to hold on to their positions. Due to the failures around The Hague, the defense of the northern end of the Willems Bridge became the focus of German airborne operations in the area. The commander of the troops in The Hague, with the general failure of his operations, was ordered to abandon his tasks entirely and to instead try to move as many troops as possible down to Rotterdam to assist. Overall, the airborne operations were costly for the German airborne troops, but they were still a success in kind of the ways that mattered. But around half of the Ju-52 aircraft that were used were either outright lost or damaged to the point of no longer being usable. But they were able to hold on to enough of the bridges to accelerate the German attack, which is kind of what really mattered. That was their whole purpose. The Dutch defense had been counting on the difficulty of the crossings to delay the German attacks, but with intact bridges in German hands, the rivers would be far less of a problem. The first day of the attack on the ground would see successes and failures on both sides. In the opening hours of the attack, a railway bridge over the Meuse, or the Maas River, as it's called in the Netherlands, was captured intact, which immediately compromised all of the Dutch defenses in the area, as German forces moved over the bridge to continue forward. However, there would be an attempt to capture another bridge over the river, and that would be far less successful. And this was a bridge located in Maastricht, which was attacked by German troops that were dressed in Dutch uniforms to try and kind of sow some confusion among the defenders, but it would still fail. This failure allowed the Dutch defenders time to blow all three of the bridges over the Maas River in Maastricht, which was great because it would delay the German forces in the area for about a day. In the center and on the northern end of the attack, the advance was relatively rapid, up until the point where the German forces reached what was considered to be the eastern edge of the fortress area. When they reached the defenses in this area, anchored on the rivers Lek and Ismir, the defenders were able to stop the attack, at least for some short period of time. On the second day of the attack, though, the 9th Panzer would finally be able to reach Moerdijk, which was really important for the German airborne forces that were trapped there after the failure of their earlier operations. By this point, the airborne troops were desperately short of supplies, and so the appearance of German tanks on the southern end of the Moerdijk Bridge would bring a sort of a welcome sign of progress. On the 13th, the 9th Panzer's forward elements would cross the bridge at Moerdijk and continue on their way north, putting pressure on the Dutch defenders that were trying desperately to stop the German advance before it reached Rotterdam. By this point, the defenses along the eastern side of Fortress Holland were holding relatively well, but there was growing pressure on the Greb line near Utrecht. However, the advance to the south of Rotterdam was extremely concerning, especially due to the fact that the German forces were still in control of the Willems Bridge in southern Rotterdam. As the German forces approached from the south, there were only around 50 surviving German troops defending the approaches to the bridge, but a last-minute Dutch counterattack once again failed to make it to the bridge, and so it could not be destroyed or captured before the German armor arrived to strengthen the defense. While the German reinforcements arrived just in time for many of the pockets of German troops, for the Dutch, larger assistance from Britain and France was starting to look very unlikely. The Dutch commander General Winkelmann had hoped that the British would be able to quickly land forces on the coast, which could join the Dutch defenders of Fortress Holland, but these forces simply did not exist. and the British government would regrettably tell the Dutch that they did not have the reserves in place to help them. The only real assistance that the British could provide was the presence of the Royal Navy to carry off the Dutch gold reserves along with a large quantity of diamonds. This realization that there would be no real military assistance arriving from the sea was compounded by German successes along the Greb line near Utrecht, where units of the SS had started a serious assault on the lines on May 12th, with the fighting continuing into the next day. The fighting probably would have been over much more quickly and less costly for the Germans if more resources had been available, particularly artillery resources which were in short supply on this area of the front. While the pressure was mounting on Dutch defenders almost everywhere and things were starting to crack, French troops would arrive in Breda with 2 motorized infantry battalions and a regiment of armored cars. But by this point, all the Dutch defenders in this area were abandoning their defensive lines so that they could move north. The fact that the Dutch defenders were already moving away from the French and all the serious challenges that the French were having elsewhere meant that Gamelin would order the French forces to retreat back to the south towards Antwerp. They just weren't going to serve a purpose. By the time that the French began their retreat towards Antwerp, all along the front, Dutch forces were also in retreat, although they generally did at least do a good job of not collapsing completely, sort of given the circumstances. By the morning of May 13th, the overall situation would result in a lengthy cabinet meeting that was dominated by discussions of what the Dutch government should do next. Winkelmann would inform the political leaders of the cabinet that the situation was critical and that serious decisions needed to be made very soon. The major topic for debate that morning was whether or not the government should evacuate the country. Some were in favor of evacuating to maintain the continuity of the government, while others believed that it was their duty to stay and continue to lead from within the country. Eventually, the full cabinet would agree to board a British destroyer, which would set sail for London late on the evening of May 13th, although several of them only did this after being directly asked by the Dutch premier. The goal of this evacuation was to create a government in exile, but as with other instances where similar decisions were made, the politicians who evacuated would be heavily criticized by some Dutch citizens for abandoning the country to the Germans. This is one of those situations where I see both sides of the argument. I think that the future of the Netherlands as a political entity was probably safer with a government in exile, but it is understandable that the mass of Dutch civilians and soldiers, which were left behind, were not thrilled that their political leaders seemed to run away when the going got tough. One leader who would stay behind was Winkelmann, who, much like General Rouge in Norway, was left behind with full powers to continue the defense until such a time as he felt that it no longer served a purpose. He would take over control from the government on the evening of the 13th. In the period between when Winkelmann took command and when the official surrender would occur late on the 14th, in Rotterdam, 60 German bombers would drop over 1,300 bombs on the center of the city, resulting in the death of 814 civilians. This was done while negotiations for the surrender of the city were ongoing, but the deadline given by the Germans had been passed. The Germans would then threaten similar attacks on Amsterdam and Utrecht unless the full surrender of Dutch forces happened very quickly, and therefore Winkelmann decided to surrender, and on the morning of the 15th, that surrender was finalized. While the surrender of the Dutch military would be just one of many actions that would occur during these days in May 1940, much like many other areas of Western Europe, it was during this period that the first days of occupation, which was to last almost 5 years, would begin. The Nazi occupation of Western Europe was different than what would happen in the East, and instead of immediately beginning a repressive and violent regime against the local citizens, in the Netherlands, the initial days of fighting were followed by almost 2 years of actually relative peace. During this time, there were few overt acts of resistance, and it would only be later, as the German control of the territory tightened, that real resistance to the occupation began. But occupation was never easy for those who lived there, and the full scope of the oppression of the Dutch people, and especially Dutch Jews, is a larger conversation that demands a full episode later to discuss. All of these actions were in the future, though, because by the time that the Dutch surrendered, to the south, the continuation of Belgian resistance to the German invasion was looking more and more doubtful. We will begin telling that story next episode.